Tonight, we are commemorating the 50th anniversary of the defeat of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Yeah. People. In April 1961, a group of CIA-trained mercenaries entered Cuba with the intent of overthrowing the revolutionary government. The People's Forces, led by Fidel Castro, defeated by imperialism and organized invasion. Cameron Frank will give a report on the Bay of Pigs invasion. Please help me to welcome Frank back.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Thank you all for being here. I know it's Friday night, but it's always nice to hear political talk, especially a celebration that's so important, such as this one, because even for U.S. audiences, it's difficult to understand what happened because it's actually over a period of time and didn't just involve the invasion, but actually involved plenty of covert operations by the CIA and the U.S. Known to the U.S. audience as the Bay of Pigs invasion, Playa Girón, as the Cubans refer to it, or Girón Beach in English, was the first time U.S. imperialism was defeated in America. The events surrounding Playa Girón had a historic significance, not only for Cuba, but for the entire struggle of the oppressed throughout Latin America. In less than 72 hours, the Cuban people had not only proved to the world that a small sovereign nation could defend itself against the biggest military power in the world, but that it could also do so while declaring itself a socialist revolution in the process. Tomorrow in Cuba, Saturday, to celebrate Cuba's victory, there will be a major military parade followed by a march of tens of thousands of youth. The next 3 days, there will also be a convening of the Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba. Although we cannot be there, we are celebrating here in solidarity. After the heroic victory of the Cuban Revolution under the leadership of Comandante Fidel in 1959, Cuba fought against constant U.S.-sponsored terrorism by counter-revolutionaries that sought to overthrow the will of the Cuban masses who had liberated themselves from the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. On March 4th, 1960, approximately a year before the planned invasion of Playa Girón, the CIA assisted in the bombing of the Belgian freighter known as La Cumbre, which killed over 100 people and injured hundreds more. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. covertly supported the massive burning of sugarcane fields, pirate attacks on coastal Cuban towns, and numerous attacks against the government and cultural buildings that led to the deaths of several people. As if these constant acts of terror were not enough, the U.S. helped train militants and planned a military invasion campaign from within numerous countries in Central America, like Nicaragua and Guatemala, and in several U.S. states, like Florida and Alabama. The campaign, whose objective was to overthrow the revolutionary government of Cuba, began on April 15th, 2 days before the actual ground invasion of Playa Girón. On this day, several U.S. planes that were painted to look like Cuban planes flew out of Nicaragua and bombed 3 airports with the goal of neutralizing Cuba's Air Force. The attack killed several civilians. Most memorably, it gunned down a youth from the city of Cienfuegos by the name of Eduardo Garcia Delgado, who dramatically wrote the name of Fidel, the leader of the revolution, on a slab of wood with his own blood right before his death. The act was an iconic symbol considered to represent the loyalty of Cuban youth towards the revolutionary path of the country. The attack was so vicious that thousands of Cubans took to the streets on April 16th to pay tribute to the innocent lives lost the day before. It was on this day that Fidel Castro gave them an important speech in Cuban history on the corner of 23rd Avenue and 12th Street. This is in central Havana, and as the funeral cortege was leaving the cemetery after the burial, of those killed the day before, and amidst a massive crowd of armed revolutionaries, which you're seeing up here, Fidel Castro proclaimed the Cuban Revolution a socialist revolution. It was at this exact moment when Fidel connected the great achievements of the agrarian reform, education and health programs, to the struggle against imperialism and tied them all together to the need for socialism. Analyzing the moment, Fidel correctly stated, "This is why they cannot forgive us, that we have made a socialist revolution right under the nose of the United States." The declaration was welcomed by thousands of women and men in attendance who lifted their rifles in sign of approval for the direction of the revolution. As Fidel mobilized the country for the support of a socialist future, he also mobilized the revolutionary armed forces to protect the newly declared socialist revolution from imperialist invasion. The whole country was alert. No one knew where the invasion would occur. The U.S. banked on their bombing campaign to disrupt the ability for Cuba to fight back, because their plan went far beyond just landing 1,500 Cuban mercenaries. Their idea was that once the invaders established a beachhead, U.S. Marines would land to help the so-called provisional government. Several U.S. warships lay off the coast. Counter-revolutionary ground troops of the Mercenary Brigade 2506 landed on April 17, 1961. The operation, known as the Bay of Pigs in Washington, was met by a large and highly coordinated Cuban resistance whose direct command came from Fidel Castro himself, who was to be found on the front lines of the battle against the invading Gusanos. Using all the equipment and armaments available to them, and after intense fighting that led to the death of over 150 revolutionaries, the armed forces crushed the invasion. With it, they crushed the hopes of U.S. imperialism to once again control the resources of a sovereign nation only 80 miles away from its coast. 1,200 prisoners were captured and allowed to return to the U.S. in exchange for medicine and baby food. Thus, the newly declared Cuban Socialist Revolution demonstrated that it regarded as a higher value the basic needs of society, which was worth enough to let disgraced counter-revolutionaries return in shame to the government that funded the failed assault. The disastrous invasion was a huge embarrassment for the imperialist critics of the U.S. failure claim that it was defeated because Kennedy withdrew airstrikes that were planned during the invasion. But the truth is that the U.S. failed, and the U.S. still fails to see that the revolution had such massive support that no amount of military power was going to succeed. The failure not only led to the unification and strengthening of the Cuban Revolution, it demonstrated the victory that could be achieved by heroic people who believed in the revolution and fought bravely to defend it. Today, brothers and sisters, for workers and oppressed people the world over, the Cuban struggle offers hope. For Marxist-Leninists, it offers us yet another example of the socialist revolution and the process of becoming. Socialism is not an idealized fantasy transcribed in books. Marx always envisioned it as an inevitable progression of capitalism whose death is determined by its inherent contradiction that gives rise to struggle. It is in this struggle between the minority that has it all and the majority that has nothing, between the tiny oppressor and the mass of the oppressed, between the small ruling class and the wave of workers. That was the material basis for the Cuban Revolution and all revolutionary movements that seek real freedom and democracy, which comes about by a worker state. It is this sovereign worker state, built from the sweat and tears of the same workers who long suffered under the inhumanity of the capitalist system, that shows socialism is the only real road to liberation. That is why, when the PSL speaks in defense of Cuba and the Cuban Revolution, or when we speak in defense of all revolutionary movements that have fought to break the chains of imperialism, we do so holding a banner and a bullhorn in the streets. We support these groups humbly, and with full awareness of the struggle and inspiration their sacrifice has brought to the world, the oppressed, and to the workers' revolutionary struggle against imperialism and for socialism. It is as Fidel said, when the beast of imperialism was defeated for the first time, say what you will after Girón. All the peoples of America will be a little bit freer. And as the small indomitable nation continues struggling under the brutal blockade, the cruel imprisonment of the Cuban 5 heroes, the constant media and diplomatic attacks, and the relentless U.S. intervention, we in the PSL always say, with Cuba, all peoples of America and the world will be freer. Viva Cuba Libre, viva la lucha socialista.